Right, so Israel has spent months treating the Quneitra frontier like a bit of an empty countryside that nobody would miss, pushing in a little further each week and just assuming Syria would just swallow it because the new leadership has been far too busy rebuilding a state in its Al-Qaeda cast-off image to worry about fighting over every inch of its soil. And for a while that was certainly true. Syria did try to play the good diplomatic citizen after sanctions were lifted, tried talking, tried keeping the West on side, and what did it get for that restraint? The Israeli Prime Minister strolling straight into the UN monitored buffer zone with cameras rolling as if the 1974 agreement between the two states was something he could wipe off with a bit of spit polish. Here we go again. And all of that when it comes to Israel. But when Russia suddenly reappeared in Quneitra days later, touring the line, preparing military posts, it wasn't nostalgia happening here. It was Syria finally saying, well, if Israel isn't going to respect our border, we'll get in somebody else who will. Right, so the simplest way to start is by saying what's actually happening on Israel's northern frontier without all the diplomatic varnish that's been spread all over it. The border inside Quneitra isn't stable. It hasn't been stable for months, has it? It hasn't been treated as stable by the one state that insists it's the victim of everyone else's instability. Israel has been pushing deeper and deeper into Syrian territory for almost a year now since the Assad regime fell, advancing into villages on the Syrian side of the line, setting up new points of control, treating the 1974 disengagement agreement with Syria like it's a helpful suggestion rather than an obligation on their part. Everyone can see this because it's happening in broad daylight and because it's happening in public on a frontier monitored by the UN. The pretense that these moves are defensive or accidental simply can't be sustained. And then you had the moment that broke whatever illusion was left of it anyway, because Benjamin Netanyahu then walked into that buffer zone on camera. He didn't sneak in, he didn't deny it, he marched into territory explicitly designated as off limits to Israel, gathered soldiers around him, made a statement about the importance of Israel's presence there, and left again. And when the UN responded, they described the visit as a violation of the agreement that underpins that frontier. Well, what are you going to do about it then? What have you been doing for the last year while they've been constantly crossing it? Sweet FA as per usual. Syria said the same, but who's actually listening when you spent so long trying to be besties with Israel as they've been doing all the invading of your land anyway? But that is actually the point now. Syria hasn't leapt into this moment by any means. It has been pushed into it slowly over a year that's been defined by its attempts to fix a state after seizing it from Bashar al-Assad, and that butt-kissing towards Netanyahu just has not paid off. They don't want a functional state, be it the Al-Qaeda castoffs of Ahmad al-Sharaa running it, or the Assad regime before him. When the old government fell in December of last year, the new leadership began trying to build something resembling a government from the ground up. It has worked to reopen connections with the international system. This is all regardless of what you actually think of them, and by calling them Al-Qaeda castoffs, you can imagine what I actually think of them. But it worked to negotiate its way out of sanctions that have been strangling it. They have achieved that. It chose to restore relations with states that have spent years refusing to speak to it, mainly the West, because all of a sudden this new leadership is acceptable, even if they did formerly have a $10 million bounty on this chap's head. And it had all to do with all of this while avoiding another war on a border that's been hit by hundreds of Israeli strikes over the years. So Syria did what weak states always do when they're overstretched, in effect. It tolerated things it didn't want to tolerate. It tolerated Israeli airstrikes even after the foreign-backed militias Israel used as justification had left the south. It tolerated Israeli forces pushing into border villages. It tolerated checkpoints being raised inside its territory. It tolerated infrastructure being hit. It tolerated language from Israeli officials about indefinite occupation of that southern zone. And it tolerated all of this because it was trying to stop the country from fracturing even further. It thought that by keeping things quiet, by keeping the diplomatic momentum going with the West, by avoiding public escalation, it could buy time to rebuild. And for a while, it did work. Sanctions were suspended. Diplomatic channels were restored. Syrian embassies have been reopening. Al-Sharaa cropped up in the White House. He went to Washington, something that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. British sanctions were lifted. You could see why Syria was willing to tolerate what no state should ever have to accept, because the alternative was just another front collapsing. But what Israel saw wasn't restraint, it was opportunity. Israel treated the collapse of the old Syrian government as a reset moment. It believed the border was open terrain now. It believed that Syria's attempts to normalise with the West meant it wouldn't push back. It believed Russia's decision to pull out of Syria meant the frontier was now unprotected by any of those nefarious forces. And so they took full advantage, as Israel tends to do. It deepened its footprint. It advanced further into Quneitra. Whoever stops Israel from doing what it wants to do after all? It issued statements framing this presence as permanent, and it acted as if nothing would ever reverse these moves because for a year, nothing has. And then, as we've just seen, Netanyahu walked into that buffer zone, and that moment ripped the whole mask off the whole pretense. Syria's new regime has spent a year trying to stabilise itself diplomatically. It had made itself available to the West. It had restrained itself militarily, largely because it's too weak to do anything about it. And Israel responded by escalating repeatedly. And when the escalation came in the form of that public visit, Syria understood what it really meant. Diplomacy hadn't restrained Israel, and it was never going to. Diplomacy had reassured Israel that Syria couldn't or wouldn't resist them. The visit wasn't a provocation, it was a declaration. And this is where Russia ends up re-entering the story now, because Syria didn't invite Russia back into Quneitra for nostalgia or ideology. It did it because nobody else was willing to physically enforce anything on that border. Russia had spent a year pulling back from the south. It had been renegotiating its role in Syria. It had been adjusting to a new government that wasn't automatically aligned with Moscow. It had been watching from a distance as Syria rebuilt Western ties. And it had been watching Israel operate inside Syrian territory without any consequence. Russia wasn't patrolling. Russia wasn't standing on the line. Russia wasn't acting as the buffer it once had done. And Israel had noticed. And Israel had acted accordingly, sensing a vacuum, taking advantage. But then 2 weeks ago, Russian military officials arrived in southern Syria. They toured the frontier. They visited the border villages. They met Syrian defense ministers. They inspected potential posts. And Syrian officials began speaking about a deal to restore Russian presence inside Quneitra. They spoke about up to 9 observation posts. They spoke about resumed patrols. And they spoke about the need for Russia to physically return, because the situation had reached a point where diplomacy alone couldn't hold the line. And once you understand that, you see this moment for what it actually is. Not a grand realignment, but a forced correction. Syria needed Russia to prevent further encroachment. Russia needed leverage over Israel, which is aligned more closely with the West on sanctions and technology and has taken positions that undermine Moscow's interests. Israel had been acting with impunity because it thought Russia was out of the way. And the West inadvertently empowered Syria by lifting sanctions and treating the new government as legitimate. That isn't ideology, it's a structural necessity. Now, does this mean Russia and Israel are heading for open conflict? No, not necessarily. There's certainly nothing in any verified reporting that suggests Russia is preparing for war against Israel here. No mobilization, no deployment of combat units, no threats. What the reporting does show is that Russia intends to place personnel in an area where Israeli forces have been operating, and that is enough to change the risk dynamics entirely, because the problem isn't intent, the problem is proximity. 2 states with incompatible objectives are about to operate inside the same narrow strip of land. One side insists the area must be demilitarized indefinitely, the other insists that presence is illegal, and the third intends to monitor the line. It doesn't take prediction to understand how fragile all of this basic geometry is. It takes basic recognition of what happens when opposing forces are standing too close together. And the reason this situation feels different from previous years is because the power dynamics have shifted in every single direction. Syria is no longer as isolated as Israel assumed it was. The West has stopped treating it as untouchable. Russia is no longer absent. The UN has stopped muting its warnings, but it's not doing anything beyond making them. And Israel is no longer operating inside any sort of vacuum here. The old assumptions, basically, that Syria was too weak, that Russia was distracted with Ukraine, that the West was too hostile to Syria, that UN agreements were outdated and not backed up. Well, that last one might have a ring of truth to it. But they've all collapsed in the space of weeks to greater or lesser extents. And you don't need to speculate about what that means. You just follow the sequence. Israel escalated. Syria finally snapped. Russia have returned. And the UN, well, they've objected, but hand-wringing is all they ever do. And the West went silent because it didn't want to undermine its own rehabilitation of Syria, which, of course, has been very, very recent in and of itself. And if you pull back even further, you can see how absurd the underlying logic has been. Israel assumed it could manage Syria the way it did in the 2010s, when the state was collapsing and Russia was the only actor keeping it afloat. Syria assumed it could manage Israel through quiet diplomacy, even as Israel was expanding inside its land. Russia assumed it could negotiate a calm re-entry on its own terms, and The West assumed its sanction relief would gently move Syria westward. All four assumptions are incompatible, and it only took one physical action, a visit, to actually collapse the entire diplomatic scaffolding holding this entire frontier together now. The truth is really quite simple. Syria didn't snap because of politics, it snapped because of land grabs. Because Israel crossed a line that wasn't supposed to be crossed, and because the only actor capable of physically reinforcing that line wasn't anyone in the West, no desire to from any of them, it ended up being Russia. Syria didn't want to rely on Russia again. Russia didn't want to pay the price of enforcing this frontier either, I dare say. The West didn't want to admit that its own moves had consequences, and these are what they've led to. And Israel certainly didn't want to believe that Syria still had the ability to say no to them, but here we are. The line had been crossed, the deal has been struck, and the frontier is about to be populated by people who haven't shared it in years. So the real question isn't, has Syria snapped? It has. The real question is why anyone thought it wouldn't. It tolerated more in 12 months than most states tolerate in a decade. It accepted diplomatic humiliations. It accepted military incursions, all from a state it really wanted to be allies with and repeatedly had said so. It accepted endless condition setting from states that weren't standing on its border. And the moment it became clear that restraint was interpreted as surrender, it did what every state eventually has to. It put someone on the line who could actually stop the encroachment. And that's the verdict here. Syria didn't snap with a statement. It snapped because Israel crossed a boundary it assumed no longer mattered, because it's what Israel always does. Russia didn't return out of loyalty. It returned because the frontier is where its leverage is. And the West didn't intend to empower Syria. It just stripped away the last constraint preventing Syria from refusing to absorb more incursions. Israel comes first. Syria finally getting the message. The next phase won't be shaped by press conferences or diplomatic statements. It'll be shaped by who stands where. Because that's where this entire crisis has been forged from the start, on the ground, inch by inch, until somebody finally said enough. It's not just Israel that Russia is thumbing their nose at through these actions, of course. It's the entire West, isn't it? Especially the US. And it's not the only swipe at Trump they've delivered in the last couple of weeks, as they are increasingly arming Venezuela as tensions rise in the Caribbean. So get all the details of that story there. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next one. Cheers, folks.